Have you ever thought about how something so delicate and joyful as music could once carry with it such quiet dangers? When we picture instruments today, we imagine polished violins in glowing cases, or guitars slung casually across shoulders, or pianos resting safely in their corners. Yet in centuries past, the act of carrying an instrument through a town or along a country road was not nearly so simple. These objects were beautiful, yes, but they were also burdens, sometimes even traps, and the people who carried them lived with a constant awareness of how easily things could go wrong. Hello everyone and welcome. Tonight, as we drift together into a slower, calmer rhythm of storytelling, I want to take you on a journey into the overlooked risks of the past. We'll see why musicians, travelers, and ordinary carriers of instruments often found themselves exposed, not only to the elements but also to the judgment of strangers, the curiosity of children, and the frailty of the very music they hoped to preserve. If you enjoy these gentle explorations of forgotten history, I'll softly remind you to subscribe so you can join me again for more quiet stories of the past. Carrying an instrument might sound simple, but it was an exercise in constant vigilance. Unlike sacks of grain or bundles of firewood, these were fragile companions. The polished wood of a lute or viol was vulnerable to rain, swelling with damp air and shrinking again when dried until seams split and strings loosened. A flute might slip from the hand and crack on cobblestone. A drum could be ruined in a moment if its skin tore. And because instruments were rarely cheap or replaceable, every crack or split carried consequences far greater than the object itself. The person carrying it was not only responsible for its weight, but also for the sound locked inside, and for the time and labor it represented. The journey of carrying such objects was shaped by the roads themselves. Paths were rough, sometimes nothing more than packed earth, uneven and soft by rain. Stones protruded, carts rumbled, and people stumbled often. To walk with an instrument meant guarding it with every step, never letting it bump or swing. A careless jolt that might mean nothing to a basket of apples could ruin weeks of craftsmanship in an instant. Musicians wrapped their treasures in cloth or leather, but no wrapping was truly safe. Cloth grew heavy with water and storms, leather stiffened and cracked, wooden cases split when jolted too hard. The traveler had to tread with the patience of someone carrying glass, even when hurrying to a destination. Then there was the weather, always a silent enemy. Instruments responded to it more than most possessions. Cold tightened strings until they snapped, while heat warped the wood. Sudden shifts from damp fog to dry winds made instruments complain in squeaks and groans, as though they themselves disliked the journey. To carry one openly under a shifting sky was to gamble with forces no person could control. Imagine walking with a viol pressed close to your chest as a summer storm rolled across the horizon. Each drop of rain struck like a warning. To the passer-by, it might look like nothing more than a man hurrying home, but for the musician it was a race between water and wood. Even in fair weather, there were risks of attention. Carrying an instrument was not a private act. These objects announced themselves as clearly as banners. A man with a lute tucked under his arm was recognized instantly, and recognition was not always kind. Crowds were quick to form, curious to hear a song or quick to pass judgment on his presence. To some, musicians symbolized entertainment. To others, idleness or wandering. A woman carrying a harp might be admired by some, whispered about by others. Children followed, laughing or mocking, pretending to play invisible instruments in the air. And in darker corners of towns, thieves noticed too. Where there was an instrument, there might also be coins earned from it, and the weight of envy was heavier than the instrument itself. Suspicion followed as well. In communities wary of strangers, an unfamiliar object was often greeted with questions. A pipe case could be mistaken for something hidden, a harp thought too fine for a traveler of modest dress. People asked where it had come from, who had given it, and what it was worth. Those questions were not always curious. Sometimes they carried the tone of accusation, and so the act of carrying music could turn into an unwanted interrogation, the owner forced to defend not only the instrument, but their right to hold it. The strain of carrying was not only social, but physical. A lute might not weigh as much as a sack of flour, yet its delicate build made it far more exhausting to transport. You could not sling it carelessly, could not toss it to the ground when resting. Arms ached from holding it steady, shoulders burned from supporting its strap, backs bent under constant vigilance. Pauses for rest often caused new problems, for placing an instrument on the ground meant exposing it to dirt, moisture, or curious hands. And so many carried on without pause, walking longer than was comfortable, sacrificing their own ease for the safety of their instrument. What made this burden even heavier was cost. Instruments were not easily replaced. They were products of skilled craftsmanship, often requiring weeks of careful labor to complete. Every joint had to be precise, every surface polished, every string measured. To own one was to carry a piece of wealth, sometimes greater than the rest of a traveler's belongings combined. Losing it to weather, theft, or clumsiness was not merely unfortunate. It could ruin a livelihood, and everyone who carried one knew this. They walked with the constant awareness that each step could be the one that brought loss. Despite all this, people still carried instruments. They did so because music was more than decoration. It filled halls with life, softened the silence of lonely nights, lifted gatherings into memory. The risks were great, but the reward, the sound waiting inside the wood and strings, was greater. The musician accepted the danger because the music made the danger worth it. And so instruments were carried across fields, along roads, through crowded streets and quiet villages, each one a fragile promise that beauty could still be made, even in a world full of risk. It is easy for us today to forget how much responsibility once rested in the act of carrying these treasures. We think of music as effortless, but behind every note there was a journey of careful steps, watchful glances, aching arms, and worried minds. Every song that filled a room was the result not just of talent, but of safe passage, of hours spent guarding fragile wood against rain, protecting strings from rough handling, and shielding sound itself from the dangers of the world. And so, carrying an instrument was never as simple as it looked. It was an act of patience, vigilance, and hope. Each journey carried the possibility of failure, but also the promise of beauty. Those who undertook it knew both sides of the risk, yet they carried on, because the music inside was too precious to be left behind. Imagine setting out at dawn, the world still quiet, the mist of early morning resting on fields and cobblestones. In your hands, across your back, or under your arm is not a sack of grain, not a bundle of tools, but a musical instrument. The road before you is long, uneven, and uncertain, and with every step you take, you are reminded that what you carry is not only fragile, but also valuable in ways most travelers cannot see. The road is not your enemy, but it is never your friend. The first challenge lies in the surface itself. Roads of the past were rarely smooth, often nothing more than hardened earth, scattered with stones that pushed against the soles of boots. Wheels carved grooves into the mud, turning to ridges when the sun baked the ground. Rain made rivers of the paths, washing away soil and leaving pits where feet sank deep. A careless step could unbalance the body, sending the instrument against a wall or to the ground, where one crack might end its life as a tool of beauty. Those who carried instruments quickly learned to walk differently. Their strides were careful, their eyes always cast downward, scanning for hidden risks in the earth beneath them. The roads were narrow, often shared by carts, animals, and crowds of people. Imagine being pressed to the side as a wagon rattled past, its wooden wheels spraying mud. You would lift your case high, twisting your body so no splintered corner struck the wood. In busy markets, elbows brushed too close. Children reached with curious hands, and each movement felt like an intrusion on the fragile cargo you guarded. The road was not empty space, but a battlefield of small, constant threats. And then there was distance. A journey of 1 or 2 miles could already leave arms sore, shoulders marked with straps that cut into flesh, and backs bent from the unnatural weight. A drum slung behind might thud with each step, reminding you of its presence. A harp too large to disguise would tower like a flag, announcing you from afar. Smaller instruments like pipes or flutes were easier to carry but could still vanish with one misstep, slipping from a fold of cloth into dust or grass where they would be trampled underfoot. Every distance felt longer when measured not by miles, but by how many more minutes the instrument could endure without mishap. Travelers adapted with tricks that now seemed simple, but were born from necessity. Some wrapped cords around their instruments, tying them to their bodies as if to anchor them against the jostle of the road. Others created padded claws from worn garments, layering them so the case had some cushion if struck. None of these were perfect. Straps cut, claws tore, knots slipped. The musician often arrived with sore muscles, and a case more worn than before. The road always demanded something in return. The weather added its voice to the struggle. A clear morning could turn to rain by midday, soaking leather coverings until they sagged and stuck to the wood beneath. Storms blew dust into seams, clogging joints and scratching polish. Sunlight itself was no gift, for it dried wood too quickly, warping thin panels until the sound box sang in strange tones. Cold stiffened strings until they snapped at a touch. Carrying an instrument meant fighting the weather as much as the distance, for every element of sky and earth sought to undo the fragile harmony locked inside. And beyond the road itself there were people. Crowds pressed too close. Curious strangers asked to see what lay inside a case, and not all had harmless intentions. In some places the sight of an instrument stirred admiration, but in others it stirred resentment. Those who struggled for daily bread often viewed the musician with suspicion. Why should this one carry something so fine? They might mutter. The traveler could not always explain that music was work, not luxury, and so he walked quickly, eyes down, shoulders hunched. as if hiding the object in plain sight. Animals added their own unpredictability. Horses shied at sudden sounds, goats butted against whatever seemed unusual, and dogs barked furiously at the gleam of strings. A single animal could undo hours of careful progress with one careless lunge. There are stories of fiddlers losing their instruments to muddy streams after being startled by herds, the cases swept away before they could be recovered. Every living creature along the road seemed to conspire against the safety of music. The strain was not only physical, but mental. Each step was weighed with worry. What if the strap broke? What if the rain worsened? What if curious hands pulled too close in the next village? The mind rehearsed dangers endlessly. The burden of imagination as heavy as the instrument itself. By the time the destination appeared on the horizon, whether an inn, a market, or a gathering hall, the musician's relief was not only from fatigue, but from the realization that the instrument had survived. Yet even in these constant risks, the road carried a strange rhythm of its own. The steady beat of boots, the sway of straps, the creak of wood all created a silent melody that only the carrier could hear. Each journey was not just about survival, but about anticipation, the knowledge that once the road was done, the music would begin. This anticipation was powerful enough to carry many through hardships that might otherwise have broken their resolve. Still, the dangers of the road remained. Roads tested not only the instrument, but the patience, endurance, and spirit of the one who carried it. For many, the memory of the music that would follow was the only thing that made the risks worth taking. In the quiet of their steps, they carried not just wood and string, but hope itself, fragile and heavy all at once. And so, each journey with an instrument became its own kind of performance. The world outside never heard it, but the carrier knew the rhythm well, the constant balancing of weight, the measured pace of feet, the careful shielding of wood from weather and hands. It was a performance of silence with the road as stage, and the final applause waiting only when the instrument arrived whole. That is why roads of the past are remembered not just for where they led, but for what they demanded. They were testing grounds for music long before a single note was played, and those who walked them with instruments in hand carried not only their tools of art, but their very lives of sound, bound tightly together by every cautious step they took. Picture a narrow street in a busy town, its stones polished smooth by countless feet, its air heavy with smoke from hearths and dust from hooves. The space is alive with sound, merchants calling, wheels rattling, children running, voices rising and falling in waves. To step into such a street with a musical instrument in hand was to enter a storm, not of weather, but of humanity itself. Unlike the open road where the danger lay in uneven earth and sudden storms, here the peril came from closeness, from the press of people, the unpredictability of crowds, and the thousand small accidents that could befall a traveler in the blink of an eye. Carrying a bundle of firewood or a sack of grain through these lanes was difficult enough, but a musical instrument multiplied the risk. Its shape did not conform to the body, its weight could not be easily shifted, and its surface demanded care. A man carrying a lute had to cradle it against his chest as though it were a child. A woman with a harp stood out immediately, its frame rising above heads, its curves impossible to disguise. Even small flutes or pipes, though easier to tuck into sleeves or satchels, risked slipping out in the bustle, lost forever between stones. The crowd itself was relentless. People brushed past without noticing. Carts rolled close with wheels tall enough to catch a case and drag it under. Elbows struck unguarded corners, knocking wood against stone. Strangers turned suddenly, bumping shoulders against fragile strings. Each step required vigilance. Each pause demanded calculation. Should the carrier move to the side, risking being trapped against walls where stones scraped polished surfaces, or remain in the center, exposed to carts and riders who pushed through with little care? There was no safe place, only the constant shifting of risk. Children were often the most unpredictable element. Curious by nature, they reached for strings, for polished surfaces, for any object that gleamed. They imitated the act of playing, strumming invisible chords in the air, laughing as they followed behind. Some meant no harm, but their energy was dangerous to fragile cargo. A single tug at a strap, a sudden push from behind, could send an instrument tumbling. Musicians learned to walk quickly, to weave through streets with a balance of speed and caution, always aware of the watchful eyes that followed. Crowds also carried the weight of suspicion. In towns where life was measured by work and necessity, an instrument suggested leisure, difference, or even strangeness. A traveler with a violin might be welcomed in one place as a bringer of music, yet frowned upon in another as an outsider carrying something unnecessary. Whispers spread quickly. Who is this? Why carry such a thing? The instrument became not just an object, but a declaration of identity. And identity could be dangerous in a world wary of strangers. Thieves, too, were drawn to instruments like moths to flame. They saw not only wood and strings, but value, the hours of labor represented, the possibility of coin earned from performance, the simple fact that anything so carefully guarded must be worth stealing. A case strapped across a back was an invitation. Cut the strap, vanish into an alley, and the owner was left with nothing but empty hands. To guard against this, many musicians kept their instruments in sight at all times, hugging them close even when exhaustion begged for rest. Sleep was rare in such moments, for how could one sleep when the crowd might reach into your dreams and snatch away the very reason for your journey? The dangers of crowded streets extended beyond theft and accidents to something quieter, but no less heavy. Envy. Not everyone who saw a musician admired them. Some resented the beauty they carried, resented that while others bent backs under loads of stone or grain, this traveler carried something that promised joy. Envy had no sound until it broke into words or gestures, but its presence was felt. Musicians walked with lowered eyes, careful not to provoke, careful not to flaunt. They knew too well that admiration and resentment were only steps apart. Even when the crowd offered welcome, the instrument demanded exposure. Imagine being stopped by townsfolk eager for a tune. The musician, weary from travel, might be asked to play in the street. Refusal could sour moods, while acceptance risked damage in the rush of listeners pressing closer. The same object that drew people together could also trap the one who carried it. Caught in obligations they had no strength to meet. The streets themselves seemed designed to conspire against music. Buildings leaned inward, casting shadows over narrow lanes. Signboards swung above, creaking as they threatened to fall with every gust of wind. Rainwater dripped from eaves, staining cloth and swelling wood. Even the stones of the street offered no mercy, slick with mud after storms, jagged with cracks that caught boots and threatened falls. The musician walked through this labyrinth not with the freedom of a passerby, but with the constant awareness that every angle, every surface, every sound might mean harm. And yet, despite the risk, the crowded streets were necessary. They connected homes to markets, markets to squares, squares to halls where music was shared. To avoid them was impossible. To endure them was unavoidable. The musician carried not only their instrument, but their patience, their courage, and their hope that the fragile gift they bore would make it safely through the chaos. There is a strange truth here. The more dangerous the streets, the more precious the music became. Each successful journey into and out of a crowded town was not merely an arrival, but a victory. Each note that sounded afterward carried the memory of survival, of stones avoided, hands guarded against, voices endured. And for those who listened unaware of the peril, the sound seemed effortless. But behind the ease of the melody was the unseen struggle of the streets, a struggle woven silently into every song. So it was that carrying an instrument in a crowded town became its own art, not of performance, but of endurance. Every careful step, every avoided elbow, every strap checked and rechecked was part of a hidden performance, one where the applause was not given in cheers, but in the simple fact that the instrument arrived intact. And while the streets tested the carrier with every breath, they also shaped them into guardians, keepers of sound, protectors of fragile beauty, in a world too rough to notice. There is something almost poetic in the image of a traveler walking alone, carrying an instrument across the land. The quiet fields stretch out on both sides, the air alive with birdsong, the earth soft beneath tired feet. From a distance it looks serene, almost romantic, but for the one actually carrying the instrument, the journey was anything but calm. Silence, though peaceful, was never safe. It concealed dangers, sharpened awareness, and reminded the musician with every step that what they carried was both precious and perilous. The first danger in silence was the way it magnified small sounds. A creak from a wooden case, a snap from a strained strap. Even the faint rasp of cloth against leather felt louder in the stillness. Each noise sparked fear. Was the case giving way? Was a string loosening? Would one more mile bring disaster? The carrier's ears, sharpened by worry, picked up every detail, and silence became not a companion but an echo chamber of anxiety. Loneliness deepened the strain. In busy towns, dangers came from crowds, but there was at least the comfort of being seen. On the open road, silence made every traveler feel exposed. With no one to help if straps tore or cases cracked, the musician carried not only the instrument, but also the weight of responsibility without support. If the road curved through forests or dipped into valleys, the silence pressed heavier, as though the world itself had pulled back, leaving the traveler to face the risks alone. The land itself added to the uncertainty. Winds blew dust that settled into seams. Small pebbles worked their way into cases. Sudden gusts pulled straps loose. Every turn of the path held its own test. Over hills the instrument shifted, dragging at shoulders. Across streams it had to be lifted high, straining arms already weary. Bridges swayed, threatening to shake wood against wood, or worse, to send it tumbling if footing slipped. The silence of the land did not mean safety. It meant that every risk echoed more loudly, every stumble carried more weight. Animals along the road brought new threats. Dogs barked at the gleam of polished wood, sometimes lunging close. Horses startled easily at the shape of bulky instruments, and their hooves struck the ground with a force that could send vibrations through the very cases themselves. Birds, seemingly harmless, sometimes swooped at shiny strings or bits of cloth, mistaking them for food. Even insects played their part, burrowing into cases left open for just a moment too long during a rest. The musician learned quickly that silence did not mean absence of life. It meant every sound, every movement was magnified against the backdrop of stillness. Weather haunted the solitary traveler as much as it did those in towns. In silence, storms announced themselves with terrifying clarity. A single rumble of thunder seemed to fill the entire sky. Rain fell harder when it was the only sound. Wind whistled cruelly through straps, tugging at cases until the weight seemed doubled. Even the sun, though quiet, pressed down relentlessly, drying wood until cracks appeared. Silence did not protect from the weather. It made the musician hear and feel each change more acutely, each shift more dangerous. The instrument itself sometimes betrayed its carrier in silence. Strings loosened and buzzed faintly, pegs creaked, frames sighed with the strain of travel. For the musician, these were not simple noises, they were warnings. Each sound hinted at weakness, at the possibility of failure. Carrying an instrument meant not just watching the road, but listening constantly for the faintest sign that something within was breaking. A snapped string or cracked panel was not just an inconvenience. It was a blow to livelihood, to pride, and sometimes to survival. Fatigue added its own silent danger. With no voices around, no crowds to jostle, the mind wandered. Shoulders slumped, steps dragged, attention wavered. And in that brief lapse, straps slipped, instruments shifted, and mistakes happened. A moment's daydream could become the cause of weeks of grief if the instrument fell. Silence, though restful for the ears, demanded constant alertness from the body. And yet, within all this tension, silence carried a strange kind of beauty. It allowed the musician to feel every part of their journey more deeply. The touch of the instrument against their chest, the rhythm of steps, the weight that shifted with each breath, all of it became part of a hidden music. It was a song no one else could hear, composed of careful movements and fragile hope. Though dangerous, it was also intimate. The musician came to know their instrument not just through playing, but through carrying, through every ache it caused, every worry it inspired, every sigh of relief when it survived another mile. There was also the simple fact that silence gave space for thought. Many travelers, despite the risk, used these hours to compose melodies in their minds. Each worry became a note, each obstacle a chord. They imagined the relief of finally playing, the joy of hearing sound emerge after so many careful, silent miles. In this way, silence turned burden into inspiration, though inspiration could never erase the danger. So the road in silence was both enemy and companion. It tested endurance, sharpened fear, but also gave moments of reflection that no crowded street could offer. The musician walked in constant tension, balancing risk and beauty with every step. Silence made the burden heavier, but it also made the music, when it finally came, feel lighter, brighter, and infinitely more precious. And thus, To carry an instrument across silent stretches of land was to carry more than wood and string. It was to carry every sound that silence threatened to swallow, every note that could not yet be played, every hope that the journey would end with music instead of loss. It was a fragile burden, but one willingly borne, for without it, the world would have been emptier, quieter, and far less alive. There is a saying, unspoken, but felt across centuries, that beauty is never without burden. This was never more true than for those who carried musical instruments from one place to another. To look at them from afar, you might think only of the joy they would soon bring, the melodies in warm halls, the songs at gatherings, the moments when silence gave way to sound. Yet behind every performance was a story of labor, risk, and quiet sacrifice. Instruments were fragile, but more than that, they were costly in ways few outsiders understood. The cost was not only measured in coins. Of course, instruments themselves were expensive to buy or commission, built by craftsmen whose hands shaped wood with patient precision. But once they were made, they demanded constant care. Carrying them turned ordinary travel into something far heavier, something that taxed the body, strained the mind, and sometimes altered the very course of a journey. Every player or messenger who took one across roads and streets knew that they were not only transporting sound, they were gambling with time, with effort, and with the possibility of loss. Consider the sheer labor of it. A lute or violin might not weigh as much as a sack of flour, yet it was far more exhausting to carry. A sack could be tossed down without worry, dropped in haste, or balanced roughly on a shoulder. But an instrument required tenderness. It had to be cradled, shielded from elbows, kept away from sharp corners. It never allowed its carrier to walk with ease. Every stride had to be measured, every rest deliberate, every pause chosen carefully to avoid damage. The body tired not from weight alone, but from constant awareness, the unrelenting effort of protecting something that could not protect itself. The cost also appeared in time. To carry an instrument was to travel more slowly than others. Roads had to be measured carefully, markets crossed with patience. Where another traveler might cut quickly through a crowd, an instrument carrier lingered at the edges, waiting for openings, weaving carefully to avoid brushes or blows. Journeys stretched longer, often doubled, because safety came before speed. For those hired to play at festivals or gatherings, this meant leaving earlier, sacrificing hours of rest to ensure the instrument arrived in one piece. The road demanded not only strength but patience, and patience was a form of cost not everyone could afford. Then there was the cost of worry. It is hard to measure anxiety in coin, but it weighed just as heavily. Each sound, a creak in the case, a snap of a strap, a rattle from within, became a warning. Each drop of rain was a threat. Each glance from a stranger carried suspicion. The carrier's mind was never free. Even in moments of calm, their thoughts circled back to the same questions. Will it survive the journey? Will I reach the hall with the strings intact? Will I arrive not with music, but with silence? That constant fear was its own burden, invisible to others, but etched into the carrier's posture. Their careful steps, the way their eyes darted to every possible source of harm. There were social costs, too. Carrying an instrument marked a person as different, and difference in crowded towns often brought whispers. Some admired, some envied, some resented. A fiddler walking into a marketplace might be greeted with laughter and applause, but just as easily with suspicion. A woman carrying a harp might be admired by some, dismissed as frivolous by others. The instrument was never invisible. It announced itself to every eye, and the one who bore it had to live with whatever attention followed. That attention could lead to invitations, but it could just as easily lead to ridicule or theft. Even the act of resting carried hidden costs. Imagine reaching the edge of a field after miles of walking, body aching for pause. For any other traveler, rest meant dropping burdens to the ground, stretching limbs, and closing eyes. For the musician, rest was careful. They had to search for safe ground, free of damp, dirt, or stone sharp enough to scar wood. They had to lay cloth beneath cases, shield them from sun or drizzle, sometimes even keep them on their laps to avoid harm. Rest was never truly restful, because vigilance never ceased. The price of one careless pause could be weeks of repair or the end of an instrument's life. And yet, people bore these costs willingly. Why? Because the reward was unlike any other. At the end of the journey came music, and music was worth more than comfort, more than speed, more than the easy travel others enjoyed. A single melody that lifted hearts, a song that filled silence with warmth, was enough to justify the burden. Carriers of instruments accepted risk not because they loved hardship, but because they knew that hardship was the path to beauty. It is a quiet reminder, too, for us listening centuries later. Much of what we admire in history, the songs passed down, the instruments preserved, the melodies remembered, existed only because someone endured the hidden costs of carrying music through roads, crowds, storms, and suspicions. Without their patience, without their labor, without their willingness to pay the price, much of that sound would have been lost. And here, as we pause in this story, let me gently remind you, if these calm journeys through forgotten details of history bring you comfort, consider subscribing. It helps you return to these quiet corners whenever you wish, and ensures you won't miss the stories still waiting to be told. Now imagine once more the figure on the road. Their shoulders are weary, their mind is filled with worry, their arms ache from holding carefully, and yet there is a kind of dignity in their steps. Each cost, each burden, each sacrifice is part of something greater. They walk not just for themselves, but for the sound that will come, for the joy waiting at the end of the road. The hidden costs are heavy, but the music they guard is heavier still, and worth every risk. Daytime carried its own troubles, crowded streets, uneven roads, sudden storms, and watchful eyes, but the dangers did not end with sunset. For those who traveled with musical instruments, the night brought a different kind of burden. The darkness offered no safety, only new challenges that tested both the body and the spirit. To carry an instrument by day was to wrestle with the open world. To guard it at night was to wrestle with silence, uncertainty, and the uneasy knowledge that danger could arrive quietly. Consider first the challenge of rest. After miles of walking, the traveler longed for sleep, yet rest was never simple. An instrument could not simply be set aside like a sack or tool. It had to be kept dry, kept close, kept safe from the accidents of the night. If the traveler lay by a roadside, they had to prop the case against their body, using themselves as both cushion and shield. Sleep came lightly, interrupted by each creak of wood, each rustle in the grass, each whisper of wind that felt like a warning. The mind, even when weary, remained half awake, unwilling to surrender to dreams while the instrument lay vulnerable. In settlements, nights were not always easier. To enter a crowded lodging meant risking the curiosity of others. Strangers asked what was inside the case, whether they could see, whether they might touch. To refuse seemed rude, but to agree risked harm. A curious hand could pluck a string too roughly. A careless gesture might chip wood. A jest might end in damage. Many musicians learned to keep their instruments bound tightly, tucked close, answering questions with a smile but never opening their cases until they reached the safety of trusted halls. Even then, the weight of suspicion lingered. Who might take notice and follow when the night grew darker? The elements at night posed fresh problems. Cold sharpened, biting into wood and tightening strings until they snapped with a sound like breaking glass. Dew settled heavy, dampening cases and seeping through seams. Fires offered warmth, but too much heat warped fragile frames, and sparks leaping from the flames could scar a surface permanently. Travelers walked a narrow line, seeking warmth but never too close, seeking dryness but never too exposed. The night turned every natural element into a puzzle, each choice carrying risk. Animals became bolder when the sun set. Dogs barked at unfamiliar shapes, rats gnawed at leather bindings, insects crept into cracks. Horses and donkeys, startled in the dark, might stumble into resting musicians, threatening to crush what they carried. Even the distant cries of wolves or owls, though far from immediate harm, sent shivers through weary bodies. The musician lay awake, hand resting on the case, feeling each sound as a possible danger creeping closer. Loneliness magnified all of this. By day, even in struggle, there were people around, merchants, children, fellow travelers. At night, the silence of isolation pressed harder. The weight of responsibility grew heavier without witnesses, as though the entire fate of music rested in one person's hands. The stars looked down, indifferent, while the earth beneath felt both comforting and unforgiving. To sleep beside an instrument was to sleep with worry for company, a companion that never left until morning light returned. Some musicians told of vivid dreams that haunted them during such nights. Dreams of strings snapping in silence, of cases cracking open, of waking to find their instruments gone. These were not just the imaginings of tired minds, but reflections of real fears. Each dream carried the echo of true loss experienced by others on lonely roads. To dream of such a thing was to feel again the tension of carrying, even in the safety of rest. There was also the challenge of space. Instruments were rarely small. A drum took room, a harp more still. Even a lute or violin demanded careful placement. In cramped quarters, this meant squeezing into uncomfortable positions, curling around the object as though it were another body sharing the bed of grass or straw. Sleep came awkwardly, bones aching from twisted poses, yet the alternative, placing the instrument away from reach, was unthinkable. Distance was danger. Closeness, though uncomfortable, was the only shield. And yet, despite the difficulty, nights with instruments carried a strange intimacy. The musician grew to know the object not only in performance, but in the quiet hours of protection. Each scrape, each faint set of wood and varnish, each curve of the frame became familiar, almost like a companion. The relationship between carrier and instrument deepened, not through playing, but through guarding. The sound yet to be played seemed to hum faintly in the air, as though the instrument itself waited patiently for dawn, when hands could coax melody from its silence. In towns and villages, nights could hold a peculiar mix of risk and relief. A roof offered shelter, but walls carried their own dangers. Beams groaned, dripping rain from leaks, dust sifted down, threatening open seams. Sharing space with others meant guarding the instrument against careless feet, against children who might stumble too close in play. Even trusted hosts could pose problems, urging a musician to play when exhaustion begged for sleep. Each choice, whether to refuse or accept, carried its own consequence, and the musician weighed them carefully, knowing that politeness could sometimes risk the very thing they sought to protect. It is worth remembering that these nights were endured not once, but many times. For every festival, every gathering, every performance in a hall, there were dozens of nights where instruments were guarded like treasures, carried into sleep as burdens, and watched over as though the world might at any moment try to steal them away. The music people heard with joy was born out of these long, uneasy nights, where silence pressed heavily, and every sound of the dark carried the weight of possible danger. And still, musicians chose to carry. Despite sleeplessness, despite cold, despite fear, they kept their instruments close, for they knew that without them there could be no music, and without music the world would feel less alive. The uneasy nights were the price of beauty, and though the price was high, it was willingly paid, over and over, in the hope that dawn would bring safety, and with it the chance to let the silent companion finally sing. Markets were the beating hearts of towns, places where people gathered not only to trade goods, but to exchange news, to meet neighbors, to argue, to laugh, to haggle, and to observe the rhythm of life. For those who carried musical instruments, however, markets were not places of ease. They were labyrinths of risk, crowded with people and noise, every corner holding a new hazard for fragile wood and string. To step into a market carrying music was to enter a storm disguised as a festival. Imagine the narrow stalls lined with cloths, baskets, fish, cheeses, and produce, their colors vivid in the sunlight. Merchants shouted above one another, praising their wares, trying to draw the attention of hurried buyers. Carts rattled in and out, oxen strained under loads, and buyers pressed close, examining goods with impatient hands. To move through this storm with an instrument was an act of delicate balance. The crowd surged and shifted like a tide, and the carrier had to move carefully, keeping the instrument shielded against their body, always aware of how easily one jostle could cause lasting damage. The problem was not only the closeness of people, but the unpredictability of movement. Buyers leaned suddenly, bargained with broad gestures, swung baskets without looking. Children darted between legs, chasing one another or carrying smaller purchases. A single careless elbow might strike a case, leaving scratches across polished wood. A basket swung too high could catch a strap and drag the instrument sideways. For the musician, every step in a market felt like walking through a forest of unseen branches, each one threatening to snag or strike. Noise brought its own challenge. The constant shouting of sellers, the braying of animals, the chatter of voices made it difficult for the musician to stay alert to the faint sounds of their instrument. A creak from a stressed joint or the snap of a loosening strap could be lost in the clamor. By the time they noticed, the damage might already be done. They moved forward with heightened attention, but even the sharpest senses could be overwhelmed by the living storm of a market square. The surfaces of the market made matters worse. Ground often turned to mud from spilled water, fruit juice, or dye from cloth merchants. Straw scattered underfoot mixed with waste from animals, creating slick, uneven paths. Instruments carried close to the ground were in constant danger of being splashed, so musicians lifted their burdens higher, straining arms already tired from hours of travel. A drum might collect dust that dulled its skin, a lute might catch dampness from splashes, and pipes might clog with grits swept up from the ground. Even the very air of the market carried risks, filled with smoke from fires and the grit of dust stirred by feet. Suspicion was never absent in these places. Markets were not only for trade, but also for watching, for judging. The sight of someone carrying an instrument drew attention, and not all of it kind. Some admired, curious to hear a song. Others frowned, seeing frivolity in the midst of necessity. Questions followed. Where are you from? Why bring this here? What will you do with it? These were not always asked with kindness. Sometimes they carried a sharpness, a distrust of strangers who seemed too different. The musician could not escape notice. The instrument, even silent, announced them louder than words ever could. Thieves thrived in markets, and instruments were tempting prizes. Cut purses did not always look for coins alone. A case strapped across a back might be worth more than a purse at a belt. Some thieves followed musicians, waiting for distraction, for the moment the carrier set the instrument down to examine goods or rest. Others acted boldly, slipping through the crowd to slice straps and vanish into the press of people. Musicians often wrapped cords tightly around their arms, sacrificing comfort to ensure no quick hand could make their treasure disappear. Still, the risk was constant, and the thought of loss turned every market visit into a tense ordeal. Even when thieves did not strike, envy lingered. Among those who struggled for daily bread, the sight of an instrument suggested luxury. Why should this traveler carry something that did not fill a belly, did not plow a field, did not mend a roof? Envy whispered in glances and muttered words in the tightening of faces as the carrier passed. Some kept their eyes down to avoid confrontation, but the presence of the instrument always spoke, even when the carrier tried to walk silently. And yet, markets were unavoidable. Instruments had to pass through them because markets lay at the heart of towns, and towns lay on the paths between villages. To avoid them was to avoid roads altogether, and sometimes markets offered opportunity too. A musician might be asked to play, to fill the air with melody among the shouts of merchants and the calls of animals. For a brief moment, the crowd might pause, listening, letting the sound wash over the chaos. The risk was always present, but so too was the chance for music to transform the storm into something gentler. Still, the musician knew that for every appreciative ear, there were careless hands, suspicious eyes, and eager thieves. They moved quickly through, weaving between stalls, clutching their instruments close, waiting for the moment they could step beyond the edges of the square into quieter streets. Relief came only when the noise began to fade behind them, when the press of people thinned, and when the air felt lighter, free of the constant weight of attention. For those who carried music, markets were not places of joy, but of trial. They tested patience, demanded constant vigilance, and left bodies aching from tension as much as from weight. Each passage through a market felt like a victory, not because the musician gained anything, but because they emerged on the other side with their fragile treasure still intact. And for every listener who later enjoyed the sound of strings or pipes, that victory was invisible, hidden behind the memory of weaving through stalls and surviving the storm of human life. To carry music through markets was to walk a tightrope, balancing fragility against chaos, patience against pressure. And though many succeeded, none forgot the strain. Each note played afterward carried within it the echo of footsteps through mud, the memory of elbows brushing too close, the relief of leaving the square behind. There is a certain romance in imagining a traveler with a violin case tucked beneath one arm or a harp strapped across the back, walking along a quiet country road beneath open skies. But behind that romantic image lies a reality that was far less forgiving. The earth itself, the sky above, and the invisible changes of air were constant adversaries to those who carried musical instruments, while towns and markets brought their own threats of closeness and crowds. The open paths beyond carried dangers that were quieter but no less destructive. The first enemy was the ground itself. Paths were rarely smooth. They twisted through hills, sank into valleys, and broke apart in storms. Dry summers cracked them into jagged ridges that jarred the body with every step. Wet seasons turned them into rivers of mud where boots sank and pulled, straining legs already weary from long miles. Stones, loosened by wind or rain, slipped beneath saws, and the weight of an instrument made every stumble more dangerous. To fall while carrying grain or tools meant inconvenience. To fall with an instrument meant disaster, the possibility of wood splintering or strings snapping in an instant. Each step became an act of caution, each mile longer than it appeared, because the earth beneath could betray the traveler at any moment. Weather added its voice to this chorus of risk. Sunshine, though pleasant for the skin, was cruel to instruments. Prolonged heat dried wood until it warped, leaving seams to separate and strings to sag. Sudden shade, when a road dipped into forest, made the air cool and damp, swelling joints and weakening pegs. Rain was the most feared of all. Even a light drizzle soaked cloth wrappings and seeped into cases, softening leather and staining wood. Heavy storms could undo weeks of care in a single day, leaving the musician to watch helplessly as their companion suffered beneath the sky's relentless hand. Wind, too, was no friend. Strong gusts tugged at straps, threatened to unbalance the body, and filled cases with grit and dust. Dust worked its way into every seam, scratching surfaces, clogging small holes meant for sound, dulling the brightness of instruments that had once shone in the hands of craftsmen. And while the musicians struggled against the gusts, they also had to guard against the force pulling the instrument sideways, straining muscles already tired from the road. Even the cold carried its dangers. Frost crept into wood, tightening fibers until cracks appeared without warning. Strings snapped in the silence of night, leaving the musician to wake to the sound of loss. Frozen straps stiffened and tore, dropping cases suddenly to the ground. The beauty of a winter morning, with fields sparkling under frost, carried no joy for the one who walked with music, for they knew that each step in the chill might mean unseen damage spreading through their companion. Beyond weather and ground, there was the matter of distance. The countryside stretched on endlessly. and instruments were never light in the way they needed to be. A violin might weigh little, but its fragility made it feel heavy after miles. A harp carried across shoulders, pressed into the body until bruises bloomed beneath cloth. Even drums, hollow though they seemed, strained the back when borne for long journeys. The sheer endurance required was its own hazard. Musicians slowed their steps, not out of laziness, but from necessity, each pause calculated to balance the risk of rest against the risk of exhaustion. Rest itself was rarely restful. To sit meant finding dry ground, clearing away sharp stones, laying cloth before setting down a case. Some travelers never set their instruments down at all, preferring to cradle them even as they ate or drank, knowing too well that one careless placement could let damp seep in or insects creep close. What was meant to refresh the body often became another trial, for the mind could not relax when the instrument rested nearby, exposed to the winds of the earth. Wildlife added further unpredictability. Birds swooped at shiny surfaces, mistaking them for food. Goats butted against cases out of curiosity. Stray dogs circled, sniffing at leather straps. Horses startled at the bulky shapes, jerking reins and threatening to trample what lay in their path. Even insects were nuisances, crawling into cracks, leaving traces that corroded delicate finishes. The countryside was never empty. It was filled with creatures that saw instruments not as treasures, but as curiosities to be touched, tested, and sometimes ruined. And yet, despite all of this, the paths had to be crossed. Villages were connected by these roads, gatherings awaited at the other end, and music could not exist without travel. Every step through mud, every struggle against wind, every bead of sweat beneath a burning sun was part of the unseen work behind each note that was eventually played. When listeners heard music in safe halls or bright squares, they rarely thought of the journey it had taken to reach them, the warped wood, the strained muscles, the careful pauses taken beside wet fields. But for the musician, each note carried the memory of the path, a reminder that beauty was never free of burden. It is easy, centuries later, to look back with romantic eyes, to see the lone figure on a weathered path as a symbol of devotion and art. And in some ways that image is true, but it is also incomplete, for behind the romance was constant risk, constant vigilance, and constant sacrifice. The path tested every step, and the musician bore not only their instrument, but their hope, their patience, and their endurance, knowing that at any moment the earth, the sky, or the air itself could conspire to undo what they carried. To walk with music on weathered paths was to live in tension, balancing the desire to share beauty with the knowledge of how fragile that beauty truly was. And though many stumbled, though many instruments were lost to rain, to cracks, to sudden slips, enough survived to carry songs forward into memory. That survival was not luck alone. It was the result of countless careful steps, taken by those who bore the hidden burdens of music along roads that never gave them rest. One of the most difficult truths for those who carried musical instruments was that they could never truly disappear into the crowd. A man with a sack of flour could blend among others, carrying their daily goods. A woman with baskets of produce could slip through the lanes unnoticed, but someone with a harp rising above their shoulders, or a lute case pressed tightly against their chest, or even a small flute peeking from a leather pouch, always drew eyes. Music, even when silent, announced itself. It was as if the instrument carried its own voice, not in sound but in presence, and the world around was quick to respond. That constant attention carried with it dangers both subtle and sharp. Some were obvious, thieves who saw value in polished wood and imagined the coins that could be earned from selling it. Others were less obvious, but no less heavy. Envy lingered in the stares of those who struggled for survival, muttering under their breath about those who carried things of beauty instead of things of necessity. Suspicion lived in the narrowed eyes of villagers who wondered why a stranger would walk their streets with an object so finely made. And curiosity, though harmless at first glance, often came with grasping hands that wanted to touch, to strum, to play, without understanding how easily a string could snap or a seam could split. The constant gaze weighed on the carrier. Every step became more deliberate, every gesture more careful. Shoulders hunched, not just from the weight of the instrument, but from the pressure of knowing that eyes followed always. Even when no one spoke, the musician felt the presence of others, measuring, judging, wondering. The act of carrying became a performance of silence, with the world as audience, waiting for a mistake. The danger of being watched was not only in public squares or crowded markets, but even on lonely roads. A single passerby might notice, and that was enough. Stories spread quickly, and word of a traveler with a valuable instrument could reach others before the traveler themselves arrived. In this way, the simple fact of being seen once might create dangers miles ahead. A thief who never laid eyes on the instrument might still hear of it and wait along the path. Being watched, even briefly, carried echoes that followed long after the gaze had passed. For the carrier, this meant living in a constant state of awareness. They learned to read faces, to recognize the difference between admiration and suspicion, between curiosity and envy. They noticed how long eyes lingered, how quickly whispers spread, how children pointed and tugged at sleeves. This awareness itself was a burden. It left them weary, even in moments of safety, because they could never truly relax. To lower their guard was to invite trouble, and trouble was never far behind. This constant visibility also brought obligations. A musician walking into a village might be asked to play, even if exhausted. Refusal risked offense, while acceptance risked harm to the instrument in the chaos of gathering crowds. Some played despite their fatigue, their fingers stiff, their minds dulled, simply to appease the expectations of others. Others refused and endured the resentment that followed. Whispers of arrogance or rudeness chasing them long after they left. The instrument was both a treasure and a trap, binding its carrier to the demands of others simply by being visible. Even in safety, the gaze could be heavy. Friends and hosts, though kind, sometimes treated instruments as curiosities, asking endless questions, urging the musician to open cases and display their contents. Each request carried risk, and each refusal felt like a barrier between guest and host. The musician lived in tension, torn between gratitude for shelter and fear for the safety of what they carried. In this way, the gaze of others shaped not only the journey, but every interaction along it. And yet, in this weight of being watched, there was also something remarkable. The very attention that caused danger also gave music its power. People noticed instruments because they represented something rare, something beyond daily labor. They stirred curiosity because they promised beauty, even before a single note was heard. This promise gave the musician strength to continue. If the instrument was worth envy, suspicion, and risk, it was also worth protecting. The eyes that threatened also reminded the carrier that what they bore mattered, not only to themselves, but to the world. It is here, in this balance between burden and beauty, that the story of carrying instruments becomes so deeply human. For who among us does not carry something fragile that the world notices, judges, envies, or misunderstands? The musician's journey is simply a sharper reflection of that truth, that to carry something valuable is to carry the weight of other people's eyes. And if you've been traveling along these quiet histories with me, I'll gently remind you, subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Just as musicians carried their instruments with care, you can carry these tales with you, returning whenever you need calm company from the past. For the musician, the journey always continued, no matter how heavy the gaze. They walked on, shoulders aching, mind weary, yet holding their fragile treasure close. They endured suspicion, envy, curiosity, and demands, because at the end of it all, music waited. And music, once released, silenced every whisper, answered every question, and proved that the burden of being watched was worth bearing. There is a quiet moment at the end of every long journey when the traveler finally sets down the burden that is pressed against their back, their chest, their shoulders, and their mind. For those who carried musical instruments across roads, through markets, along weathered paths, and beneath suspicious eyes, this moment was more than relief. It was victory. The act of arriving with the instrument intact was a triumph hidden behind ordinary gestures, a story told only in aching muscles and silent gratitude. Imagine the arrival, the square of a town opening before weary eyes, the gathering hall with its doors wide, the festival ground alive with anticipation. The musician, dusty from roads, tired from nights of uneasy rest, steps forward with care, the instrument still held as though it were fragile glass. The people see only the promise of music, the beauty soon to come. They do not see the slips avoided, the storms endured, the thieves sidestepped, the sleepless nights. The applause comes later, but the first triumph is already won. The sound is still locked safely within, waiting to be freed. The act of setting the instrument down was often as careful as the act of carrying it. A flat surface had to be chosen, free of damp or dust, steady enough to support the delicate weight. Hands that had clutched tight through miles now loosened slowly, almost unwilling to let go. The body sagged in relief, but the mind still lingered on every risk just passed. Only after the case was opened, the strings tested, the wood checked for cracks, did the burden finally lift. In that moment, a strange transformation took place. The instrument, which had been a source of fear and tension, became once more a source of beauty. Its fragility was no longer a threat, but a promise. The strings that had been guarded so fiercely now sang. The wood, which had felt like weight, now resonated with warmth. What had been risk on the road became joy in the hall. The silence of carrying gave way to sound, and the burden of protection turned into the reward of music. The audience often never realized the depth of this change. For them, the music seemed effortless, as though it had sprung from nowhere. They did not know how much had been risked for each note, how much worry and vigilance had gone into ensuring that sound could exist at all. But the musician knew. Every melody was infused with memory, of raindrops that threatened, of mud that clung to boots, of eyes that followed too closely in crowded markets. The beauty of the song was sharpened by the danger that had come before it. The end of a journey also carried another truth. Instruments bore scars. They might be faint scratches across polished surfaces, worn straps from endless use, tiny cracks repaired by careful hands. Each mark was a record of survival, a testament to the risks endured. For the musician, these scars were not flaws but reminders. They spoke of roads walked, storms weathered, and dangers overcome. They turned the instrument into more than wood and string. They made it a companion, a witness to the journey, and a partner in resilience. For some, the arrival marked only a pause before another journey. Festivals ended, gatherings dispersed, and soon enough, the road called again. The musician packed their instrument with the same care, lifted it once more onto shoulders already shaped by its weight, and stepped forward into new risks. The cycle repeated endlessly, carrying, protecting, arriving, playing. The story of music was not only one of sound, but of endless movement, of journeys endured so that melodies could exist. And yet, for all its dangers, there was a quiet pride in this life. To carry music was to carry something more than fragile wood. It was to carry beauty through a world that often seemed indifferent to it. It was to protect hope, to shield joy, to guard something that made life richer, even if only for a few moments of sound. The risks did not lessen that duty. They deepened it. They made the act of carrying not just a task, but a calling. Those who carried instruments understood this truth deeply. They knew that the applause of a crowd, the laughter of a festival, the stillness of a hall listening to melody, all depended on unseen sacrifices. They knew that each song contained not only notes but footsteps, not only rhythm but vigilance, not only melody but endurance. And though the world rarely thanked them for the carrying itself, the gratitude was there, hidden in the joy of listening, in the way music changed a room. The journeys ended, yes, but the memory of them lingered in every sound. To hear a song was to hear not only the talent of the player, but the countless miles walked to protect the instrument, the storms endured to keep it safe, the nights spent awake with worry. That hidden history gave music its depth, its power, its weight. Beauty was never free. It was carried at great cost by those willing to bear it. And so, when we imagine a musician setting down their instrument at the end of a long road, let us also imagine the invisible story behind it. The story of steps taken with care, of nights endured without sleep, of dangers avoided with patience and vigilance. The story of beauty carried through risk, so that when at last the instrument was played, the world could hear not only music, but the quiet triumph of survival. The journey finally ended, but the song had just begun.